Good morning, everyone. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council. I want to welcome you all to the launch of our report on online voting, rewards and risks. And I particularly want to welcome those of you who are following this event online and through our TV audience. Welcome. And we encourage you to join the discussion using the hashtag ACEVote. That's Atlantic Council eVote, ACEVote. In a world of near infinite computing power, ubiquitous connectivity, cloud-based services, big data, where almost every task can be executed online, the fact that the vast majority of countries hold elections using paper ballots seems to be an anomaly. Online voting and e-voting has the obvious but still largely unproven potential to improve accessibility for the disabled and elderly, make long-distance voting easier, cut costs, and improve voter turnout, especially for younger generations. And although the adoption of most technologies, new technologies, it takes time, it takes effort, e-voting's benefits in terms of reach, access, and participation have the power to revolutionize the democratic process around the world. Indeed, several countries, many of whom are with us today in our audience, representatives of their nations, have implemented successful e-voting systems already: Brazil, Estonia, Switzerland. So we here at the Atlantic Council are delighted that this report today is the outcome of the effective partnership between our cyber statecraft initiative of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, the partnership they have formed with McAfee. We undertook this effort in part because of the practical results-oriented approach of our cyber team, led so ably by our top cyber expert, Jason Healey, but it also reflects the Atlantic Council commitment to nonpartisan work. This is a bipartisan issue, with both sides aiming to create a cost-effective, efficient, secure, and trustworthy voting platform. It's also a very timely discussion today as we head into the home stretch towards congressional midterm elections next month, and we face the beginnings of what is already unfolding as a presidential election 2 years out. And as we enter this season, the Council is intent on working hard to help shape a broader public debate on the role of the United States in the world, and a critical ingredient to this debate is the extent to which our own public engages in the discussion, especially through voting. So this report makes clear that online voting and e-voting could become a larger part of the political process in the United States and in other participatory democracies if the security is in place, and I think that's the key element today. We believe that this can be, should be, a bipartisan, indeed, in fact, a nonpartisan issue and endeavor. So our purpose today is to highlight that a new era in digital democracy is possible if we can get the security questions right and create trustworthy platforms. Online voting is among those transformative technologies, like the smart grid, and for which we must get security right to fully unlock its potential. So we're delighted that during the course of our program, we'll use technology to welcome the discussion Representative Jim Langevin to our discussion. Congressman Langevin, who's a ranking member of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Intelligence and Emerging Threats and Capabilities, has become a national leader on the issue of securing our nation's infrastructure against cyber threats and co-founded the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus. One of his staff members as part of our Next Generation programming is with us today. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here and for all of the work that you've been doing on this effort as well. But to kick off our program, I'd like to introduce our key partner in this endeavor. I'd like to welcome Tom McGann of McAfee, who's been a key partner as we've undertaken this report. Tom is Vice President of Government Relations at McAfee with a long track record in this field, but he began his career helpfully for our conversation today on Capitol Hill as a legislative director and chief of staff to Congressman Tom Campbell at the time. So Tom will offer a few thoughts on the changing nature of the cybersecurity debate and how cybersecurity can play a powerful role in enhancing the well-being of people's lives. So with that, I look forward to us getting into this report and for your exploring that both here in the conversation and online. So Tom, let me welcome you to the podium.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to work with such a distinguished group of people as the Atlantic Council. Indeed, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event and bringing together such a distinguished panel. The Atlantic Council is one of the leading think tanks in the world, and Jason Healey's leadership has been truly impressive. He has indeed developed a very fine cybersecurity practice that has made a significant contribution to the debate here in Washington. The Atlantic Council and McAfee, a part of Intel Security, has started a journey to change the nature of the cybersecurity debate. Our goal is to move the public discussion from one that all too often focuses on doom and gloom to one that focuses on the age of the possible. We believe that cybersecurity can play a powerful role in the betterment of people's lives. The right security can enable more opportunities for people to vote. The right security can enable secure access to online information and services. The right security can enable innovations in the area of transportation, indeed in the area of true innovations such as driverless cars. Our session today about the promise of online voting starts the discussion on the art of the possible. We welcome the active engagement from stakeholders in government, the private sector, and academia. Building a consensus on the positive role that cybersecurity can play in improving the lives of people is a vital addition to the debate. This debate for too long has been dominated by doom and gloom, the threat landscape, and an overemphasis on regulation. A more positive perspective that understands the importance of innovation and promise is a necessary addition to the debate. A more positive approach will enable the policymaking process to be more balanced, to focus less on regulation and more on the true promise of security and the power of innovation to move markets and bring better and more secure products to the marketplace. Moving forward, we're planning to launch a follow-on study that will focus on the importance of security in the area of healthcare. We now turn to the discussion at hand, the matter of e-voting.
Good morning, and thank you, Damon, and thank you, Tom, for kicking us off. Appreciate all of you being here. Let me add my thanks to McAfee, Intel Security, for making all of this possible. And for those of you following online, please follow us at hashtag ACEvote and join the discussion on Twitter. We won't get into a deep discussion on of the biographies of the people in front of you. You each have that. We'll do just a quick introduction. On my right, we have Jordi from Saito, a company that's been involved in e-voting, and we will start with him to hear some of the promise and how they get involved in this in companies, in countries all around the world to allow people to vote. To my right, Pamela Smith has been involved in electronic voting, as has Joe Hall on my left. And you can see in their biographies in many different areas to try and get through what are the most possible things in the near term and which things will take longer. Kent Landfield from McAfee on my far left, a longtime technologist that has a history of looking and trying to solve hard problems and get security to work so that we can unlock the promise of the most innovative technologies. So I wanted to start with Jordi. And your company has been in this field. You've been presented with these hard problems and have to get solutions around this. Can you walk through what are the technologies that we're really looking at here, and how have you been able to deploy them into the field in actual elections?
Okay, thanks. First of all, I want to thank the Atlantic Council to allow us or to participate in this panel. But in terms, just only a few introduction about our company. Our company is a spin-off of a research group on cryptography applied on internet voting. And from the beginning, we know that the main problem of electronic voting is not a matter of standards, of using standard security. So we use cryptography and we design cryptographic protocols to try to solve complex problems, since one of the main problems is we need to preserve privacy to voters, not only during the voting process, but also, for instance, during the decryption process, during the counting process. And this is something that is not usual in electronic transactions like e-banking. So we start to think about how to do this. We are using cryptographic protocols for allowing this, for providing this privacy and this integrity. And then another thing that we are doing recently is also providing verifiability, since it's not only a matter of providing privacy and integrity of the election, but a third point that is very important when managing an election, not only on internet voting, but in a traditional election also, is to allow people, to allow third parties to audit what is happening during the election, to provide a transparency that is not usual that is more difficult to provide when we are moving in an electronic environment. So now we are also providing this. One of the countries that is using our technology also for providing verifiability is the Norwegian country. Also in Switzerland, they are also considering the use of verifiability as an important step for providing security on electronic voting and especially on online voting. And in this case, recently they add changes on the standards required on electronic voting and especially on online voting in Switzerland, in which the use of verifiability it's important to allow voters to cast their votes. In this specific case in Switzerland, they start setting up that up to 10% of the electoral roll were allowed to vote online, just only since they start pilots for allowing internet voters, and they say, okay, they want to manage the risk of introducing internet voting in this country. And currently they change the law or they change the standards. And in case that the different cantons that are doing referendums in Switzerland, they want to increase the number of the population that can use internet voting in these referendums. In case that these cantons want to increase the number of the electoral roll up to 50% of the full roll of the voters, they need to introduce verifiability. So one of the things that we have seen that is pretty important for providing security or to manage the risk usually present on internet voting is the use of verifiability to check that at least everything is happening in a proper way and there are not problems or issues during the voting process.
So the privacy to the voters, the verifiability, the audit and transparency, and you mentioned two separate technologies. I mean, on one hand, we're talking about electronic voting, but you also had mentioned in internet voting.
Yep.
And can you just walk us through, and what do we mean by both of these? Sometimes when we add an E in front of it, we just assume that we're talking about internet, but I don't think you were, so can you clarify?
Okay, usually electronic voting is any way for using electronic means for casting of votes. This involves not only online voting, but also voting in polling stations using standalone machines, the DRE machines that are usually known here in the United States.
So like the touch, if I go in on a touch screen, that might be considered e-voting, but it wouldn't be online voting.
Exactly. So usually e-voting is more focused on these specific machines for casting votes in a polling station, standalone machines or DRE machines. Internet voting is open the door to use standard, or at least open the door to voters to cast their votes at home. There are people that are saying this as pajama voting, since you can vote at home. And in this case, what happens is that the voting terminal is is a voter device that nobody have, or at least the election officers has no control about what is installed there. So the risks the security risks are higher in these cases. And then the requirements for providing software that is more robust against any attacks during the voting process are more important.
Yeah. And Pamela, I think this is where you've been spending a lot of your time. I think you and Joe both. So, any thoughts in the report or on the things that Jordi mentioned?
Well, I'm first, thank you also for having us all here. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think that I agree strongly with the point that the report made about the difficulty and challenges of solving the security and privacy issues. With voting in a polling station with a direct recording electronic or DRE voting machine, if there are a number of issues that may come up. For example, if the equipment should happen to break down, you need something else to vote on, to replace it. Otherwise, people are disenfranchised by that malfunction. So typically, the backup is a paper ballot. If your standard voting system in the polling place is a paper ballot that's counted by an electronic machine, even if the electronic counting machine breaks down, people can still vote. So that's one of the key issues that you're looking for in a voting system is its availability to the voter when it's time to vote. With an online voting system, there may be challenges with availability if, for example, there's some kind of distributed denial of service attack that could occur during the voting period, particularly during the last phase of the voting period when everybody tends to leave everything for the last minute.
And I think this would particularly hit the United States tough because constitutionally we're voting on one day. I mean, you might be able to say, okay, well, we can spread out the voting over a longer period. If all the voting is happening on a single day, someone could just rent a denial of service attack and take it.
I think that's partly true, and we do have some states do early voting and absentee voting where you vote on a paper ballot from home and then mail it in is done over a longer period of time. But what's key here is that there is a deadline. So in the event that a denial of service attack caused a major disruption, and it happened in a time frame where there's no more time to solve that problem. There's no voting sort of after election day, so that's the deadline factor is key.
And to some degree, that's not even a voting problem. That's just a plain internet problem. I mean, that the internet can't be trustworthy on this. It's not 100% available.
Right. I think there is a lot of work being done to handle and manage DDoS attacks and those kinds of problems that can arise, and even just simple failures. We've seen failures of online voting registration systems that happened right before the deadline and caused some people not to be able to register to vote in time for the upcoming election. So timing is important, but it's also important to note that as most elections are run, they're run in the United States anyway, they're run by local jurisdictions. And local jurisdictions are counties or townships or parishes, and those counties tend not to have great big IT budgets with lots of funding for IT staff even, and really robust capabilities for avoiding the downside of a DDoS attack that maybe a major corporation even has challenges avoiding, and they're putting millions of dollars behind that. So that's another, we have to think about how elections are conducted. I think really the promise that any robust democracy makes to its citizens, to its electors, is that it will provide them with justified confidence in the accuracy of the outcome. Any voting system that you use has to be able to demonstrate clearly to the loser and their supporters that they lost. And to do that, you need actual evidence. Voters need to be able to see that their votes were captured the way that they meant for them to be, and election officials need to be able to use that evidence to demonstrate that votes were counted correctly. So that's what we look for in auditability in any voting system.
Wow,
it's a good baseline.
Right. It seems like it should be so easy, right? We have our votes. We're voting for, who's the best singer, who had the best variety act on television. Are you seeing a lot of demand? I mean, are there a lot of folks that are saying we ought to be able to have this? And this is, I think, for either the two of you. I mean, is there a lot of demand from the younger generations to be saying, how come I can't just vote on my phone? Or
I think at first there's that question, well, we do everything else online. Why wouldn't we do this online too? And what's important to note is that there are a lot of things we can do online that really support elections, that support voters being able to vote without actually getting to that last step of transmitting a voted ballot over the dangerous internet. So you can do things like registration online, you can get information online, you can get ballots to someone who's remotely located, say military and overseas voters who traditionally have had a hard time getting to be able to vote in time, get their ballots back in time. If you can transmit a ballot to them instantly, you've cut off a big chunk of the time they need in order to get that problem solved. So there are many things we do online, but what most people don't think about until you sort of talk it through is that elections have special properties that other online transactions simply don't have. The anonymity property, that votes are supposed to be anonymous, separate from your identity. You have to authenticate that the voter is an eligible voter and that's who's voting, but once you've done that, you separate that identity from their actual vote. That's a really challenging problem in auditing generally.
Yes, regarding the young generations pushing for using online voting, yes. Usually when the experience that we have, or at least when we check the statistics about who is using online voting, well, we have usually two numbers. Young people usually tend to use more online voting, and an experience that we introduce online voting in parallel with other voting channels, since we are not talking about substituting completely any kind of voting with online voting, electronic voting. And in this case, I'm talking about in France, that they are using online voting for overseas voters. What we have seen is after using 2 or 3 times, the voting channel is becoming the most predominant. In France, I think that more than 50% currently, the overseas voters are choosing internet voting as the voting channel. They can vote in person, in consulates they can vote by postal, and also by internet voting. And currently the statistics move to use more online voting. One of the reasons is that especially when we are talking about remote voting, since remote voting can be online using electronic means, or can be by postal. What happens is that postal voting, the voting channel is not, has usually problems. People don't know if finally the vote arrives or not, and they prefer then to move to internet voting.
So the internet gives that more immediate feedback than just putting a stamp on it and sending it off.
Exactly.
Which is funny because the people can probably understand what happens to an actual letter when they send it off, but they probably have no idea what happens to the packets when they send it off.
Your mailed ballots can often be trackable, so you know that it's getting back. I think one of my favorite stories about this, though, is it demonstrates that we don't really know yet about who wants to use it and how the public uses it, and is there a measurable impact on turnout. And I think that there's still more research to be done. In a place in Ontario where they decided to experiment in a pilot with allowing online voting, they had a 300% increase in turnout in early voting, but 0 turnout increase overall. And so what that meant was that people who were going to vote anyway tried out this method, but it didn't make more people vote.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And before I'm going to be turning to Joe here, and one of the things that you helped me with, and Joe, when we were reviewing the paper, was internet voting isn't just the casting of the vote. And that, I think, was an important change to the paper that we added in, was saying we've got these different, there's the registration, there's the voting, there's the collection of the votes, there's the processing of the votes. And so internet just doesn't have to be the clicking on next to a name. Right. You can look at the internet in all of these different places in ways that we can improve the process. And I was really glad for your input for that part of the paper. Now, I had first started to get interested in digital voting, electronic voting, in the early 90s. Because Alvin and Heidi Toffler were writing about the third wave. Newt Gingrich.
Before it was cool.
Newt Gingrich joined in, and they were doing books and writing together to say we can have a truer, freer democracy. more like the Founding Fathers wanted, where we can come together and we can issue our votes on home computers. They weren't thinking about phones back then. And it'll help us find this better democracy. But that was 20 years ago. And it's coming together in some places, Estonia and Seidel and others. What's the time frames looking like here, Joe, that you think?
So, I've got a few positive things to say, but a lot of what I'm going to say, unfortunately, is doom and gloom and very Debbie Downer, for lack of a better word. But certainly, I think the vast majority of experts that work on voting security and voting technology would agree that somewhere in the 30 to 40-year timeline is the point at which we'll have the infrastructure that can support secure online balloting. And there's some primitives, some basic elements that you need to have in place that haven't even been thought of yet.
30 to 40 years starting in the mid-90s, or 30
No,
to 40
sir.
years starting from now?
From right now, based on what we have. Yeah, and there's very good reasons for that. And I should say, make no mistake, we have to solve this kind of a problem. And the reason we have to do that is because to the extent that we want to have remotely physically distributed representative democracy, there's going to be situations in which physical exchange of matter is impossible. Say colonies on Mars. It's going to sound very sci-fi, but people, this may be a thing in the future. Deep sea settlements. There are places where exchanging physical matter to be the auditable record of the vote is going to be extremely challenging, if not impossible. So you either have autonomous, separate democratic bodies, or you're going to have some way of doing this kind of thing securely. And not only that, the other real big side benefit, the big sort of positive externality of doing work on this is that to the extent you solve some of the really challenging problems here, some of the very core cybersecurity issues that I know McAfee and others we work on every day, that has a lot of benefit for other kinds of applications that you can do on the internet. The one trick here is, there are a number of risks, some of which I think are solvable, some are not, and I can go through them real quick and we can follow up if you want to hear more. Unfortunately, right now, when you talk about internet voting, it is on uncontrolled platforms. And so what I mean by that is, if you're going to do some critical democratic process like voting online, you don't want to leave that up to the security of people's desktops, laptops, and phones. You have a lot of crap on your desktop, laptops, and phones, and you may not even know to the extent that you have that stuff on there. Moreover, the intelligence communities around the world have made sort of a business lately of undermining the infrastructure of the internet in such a way that you don't know exactly what is happening with this stuff. The unsupervised nature of internet voting, and this is very similar to vote by mail, and so one dirty secret from the security and privacy experts that work on this stuff is vote by mail is sort of an unfortunate legacy thing that we can't get rid of, but that has this property that unfortunately, it's very easy to coerce people that are voting in an unsupervised environment, in a place where you don't have someone making sure that the proper policies are set in place, so that someone can't sort of force you to reveal your vote to them and things like that. And people don't realize this, but there's a great paper I can point you to that shows that before around 1900, with the adoption of the secret ballot in the U.S., Election Day was a payday for many people. You could get a couple months' pay for proving to someone how you voted. And once the Australian secret ballot, which is a government-printed standard ballot cast in secret, once that spread, voter participation dropped precipitously, and it was because you no longer could make a connection between how people cast votes and the person paying it. You'd be like, okay, I give the money, I'm not really sure what happened, and oh man, the election went the other way. It's not worth my while to actually buy these votes.
Yeah. Can I ask, I know the Estonian system allows you to vote multiple times, and only your last vote cast actually counts towards the election, so that I would think that the technology might help provide a more elegant solution for this.
Yeah, those are things that help. None of those are perfect. Someone can take your Estonian ID card and after you voted, after they've watched you vote, and not let you have it back until the deadline. There's a whole lot of very layered kinds of techniques that adversaries can use to do those kinds of things. Inevitably,
makes it harder though.
It makes it harder, but at the same time, Estonia also, unfortunately, posts records of how people voted, which is, sort of contrary to having anonymity in the ballot entirely, and they have an infrastructure of, everyone, I have a bunch of these in my pocket, but everyone has sort of a cryptographic key that is associated with your identity that you use for a whole bunch of other things, and so it's almost embedded in how they interact with government, and we don't have that, and it's very unlikely that we will have.
Right, yeah, the national, if we had to have a national ID card so that we could all vote digitally, I think we would have a long time coming towards that.
There's two other real quick points I want to make. There are two other sort of risks of internet voting that I think are important to mention. I'll be really quick. One is the opportunity of wholesale versus retail kinds of attacks. And what I mean by that is, paper balloting is no panacea in the sense that you can do a lot of things like ballot stuffing. But a lot of that ends up being retail, which means you have to touch a lot of stuff, a lot of boxes, a lot of ballots in order to accomplish those kinds of attacks. Whereas with these purely software-based things, if you find one problem, say a Heartbleed, where you can get private keying material and you're recording all the encrypted traffic and you can decrypt it, say a shell shock, where you can have it run arbitrary commands. These are really serious things that any system that said it was secure was not secure the next day. So there's this wholesale retail thing. And the final thing is that by having publicly routable endpoints, servers that are accepting votes online, you expose the attack surface, the probability that someone might be able to attack this stuff to anyone in the world compared to more controlled types of systems. And we know, the second you have, and this is the last thing I'll say, the second you have some really attractive, and Jay might resonate with this, some really attractive candidate that hackers really like, the second that happens in an internet balloting election, that person will win. I can bet you $100 right now that will happen because they will find a way to subvert this in some way or the other.
Yeah, and you can imagine, there's especially in countries where it's winner take all, you can certainly imagine someone spending $1 million is not a bad investment for a piece of malicious software that would try to subvert the election. That would be small change. And I like that in the wholesale versus retail. But we know that we're going to need to do this. We can't just be staying in 50 years, 100 years, and we're still filling out paper, and we're still, doing these touchscreen machines and worrying about hanging chads and the rest. So, Kent, you're batting cleanup here. So
one of the things we need to sort of understand is that voting is an evolving process. It started very early in our republic, where you'd have to go to the courthouse and be sworn in by a judge who there was no real registration process at the time. And then from that, you would then voice your choice to a panel of folks who were keeping the tally. That was very useful because it did allow us to have outside observers to see really what the vote was and to have a very consistent vote. Fast forward to the 1990s, we start to see electronics come into the voting process, voting machines that are used for casting as well as tabulating votes. The technology has sort of driven some of the processes of what we do today. Because those machines are very costly, we try to have elections together, federal, state, and local. We try to do that at established polling places where the equipment can be brought in and the like. Today, we're dealing with a very different world than we dealt with just 10 years ago. The iPhone wasn't around. We didn't have the mobility that we have today. That's sort of driving this need, this want to be able to vote from something other than those established polling places. The problem is we're in a situation where technology is changing very quickly, but we're looking at a problem itself that does not lend itself to operating well in the generic internet environment that we have today. Identity is a real problem today. Identifying somebody definitively is something that has to be there to support the one man, one vote aspects. And efforts such as NSTIC, the National Strategy and Trusted Identity in Cyberspace, are advancing this in a very positive way from an identity perspective. There are standards efforts in the IETF OAuth is a working group around trying to figure out how to really provide real identity on the internet.
The IETF.
The Internet Engineering Task Force. They have established most of the standards that we operate under today with the internet. But the key here is that we're starting to see some of the building blocks of technology that will make the infrastructure possible. Today, we don't have an infrastructure that can successfully really work well in guaranteeing electronic voting online. There's too many ways that it can be circumvented. There's too many ways that it can be attacked. Attacked at the user's end PC where they're casting their vote. Botnets such as Zeus and others that capture keystrokes and look for certain types of activities can really be modified very easily to use that targeting internet voting. But that said, the reality of what we're seeing is technology is moving forward. We're evolving rather quickly in the last 10 years, and I don't expect that advancement to be reduced over the next 20. The focus that we need to have is to look at really what the requirements are for internet voting. They're different than e-commerce. And as such, we need to address them specifically. We need to make sure that there are real standards in place so that the folks that are, the security experts that are reviewing the different parts of the infrastructure actually have the means to have a consistent view of what's occurring. Today we have a lot of proprietary means for in the e-voting arena. We need to have this to be much more open, much more standardized so that we can see really evaluate the voting mechanisms for the security threats that could compromise a national election.
I mean, I feel like to some degree, we're not all saying that, or just this, that, you know, to fix voting, to some degree, we have to fix the internet. I mean, there's just some of the problem we've talked about, denial of service attacks, which are inherent in this internet infrastructure that we have, or the difficulty of identity. So it sounds like because the internet itself is pretty shaky, that anything that has to have the things that Jordy talked about, privacy, verifiability, audit, transparency, is going to be shaky. Although I do wonder if some of what we tend to be thinking about, especially as an American, is I tend to be thinking about the big national election, and, you know, held in November and held for hundreds of millions of people. But it seems like there are interesting case studies that are happening, whether that's in Estonia or things in the that Jordy's company is doing, or in other jurisdictions that are much smaller. You know, maybe for a citywide election, or maybe for other areas. Do we think, is that a good way to start building? And maybe Jordy, I don't know if you want to respond to some of the other things I got talked about, or, I mean, how does this work when it's not a big national election for a huge country, but, you know, building from the ground up?
Yeah, I think that what is important, well, one thing that is clear is I agree that there are risks, security risks when we are introducing internet voting, but we need to think about that risks are also present in any voting channel. So the way to manage this is to provide the proper measures for managing these risks. And this is something that is done in traditional elections, and is something that is done in internet voting. So ways for managing this, there are countries that when they start to introduce internet voting, one thing is that they are introducing internet voting involving also academics and security experts. So they can evaluate which are the security requirements that are needed to implement things in a proper way. And then they can evaluate or set up standards about which are the security requirements that needs to be fulfilled by any voting platform that is put in place. And another thing that is done is they are starting introducing e-voting in a specific, or not for the entire electoral roll, but to a specific, specific group of voters. So they can start to pilot this and see which are the reaction of the people. If they see that things are stable and they can trust what is happening. And this also involves security experts that are auditing about how things are happening there. But I think that it's important to consider internet voting, since sometimes we are not considering the risks of other voting channels that are still there. And sometimes you can solve these risks. You mentioned that in case of coercion in remote voting, in the case of Estonia and Norway and other countries are using multiple votings to allow voters to vote multiple times to prevent coercers to be sure that they are really coercing voters. And I think that it's important that these measures that are bringing this technology can be considered to solve other problems that are present in other traditional voting channels.
And the so how is Norway using?
Norway is using multiple voting. They are using
at what scale? At local, regional?
It's at municipality level. 12 municipalities was using internet voting, and they were thinking about now to introduce to other municipalities. And they are allowed to vote multiple times. The voters can vote also in polling stations. And in case that voter votes in a polling station, then this vote is the vote that will be counted. In case that the voter also vote multiple times using remote voting.
Interesting. So, any other thoughts? I mean, in this question about scale, I mean.
Sure. I think pilots are really important. There are some, you can't see them naively as being the surefire way of getting to where you want to go. You have to the extent that we want to run things in elections we really care about, you got to run them in elections we don't care as much about as the big ones for sure. But there is a couple of things, like for example, you can imagine Mr. Tony Soprano looking at a $150 million bond for a landfill or something and saying, I could spend $1 million to throw this local election. So I don't think the incentives are entirely, there are some cases where you'll see things like that being pretty serious. But at the same time, you got to do them somewhere. For example, I live in Tacoma Park, which ran the first cryptographically fully end-to-end auditable election recently in an actual government election, which is a great feat. And it's a really big learning opportunity in terms of making sure, one, that people can use these things. The real challenge with a lot of this stuff, and this is something that I work on every day, is making sure that putting a piece of paper in a ballot box is something that people can understand. We have thousands of years of experience with doing stuff like that. Whereas, cryptography, I can talk to you about, a box with 2 locks on it, and these are some toy ways we talk about doing cryptography. But it's not going to sort of give you the sort of smart high schooler level, hey, I can actually do the math on my own and get to the end. That's sort of the place we need to get to with things that are that simple, to where you can actually walk through the protocol yourself. Being sort of the smart high schooler, which is sort of my lowest common denominator.
It's important to note, too, that there are very few public test opportunities. Before you're running an election with real votes, in real time, you need to have the opportunity for white hat hackers to have at that system. And in cases where that's been allowed, like the DC case in 2010, where they ran a test before using the system in a live election, and it was breached inside of 36 hours, and there was, that was mentioned in the report, and it's a really interesting scenario, but they had to be authorized, to do this, and often, had that not been a white hat hacker, had that been somebody who had malicious intent, they might have breached the system without letting anyone know, and then later when the system is used in a live election, then have their way with the results. So it's really important that there be these public testing opportunities and that the results of those public tests are made available so that we can learn from them.
That was such a beautiful attack, too.
Yeah, do you want to, let's talk about it real quickly.
Oh, so Alex Halderman from Michigan and his team within 36 hours found a way, when you type in a file name in a little, sometimes you have to, the idea was you upload a PDF of your ballot and there's a little file picker that says, hey, go find your file, and it puts it in there. They found a way of getting crazy characters into the file name that basically got you complete control of the back-end system. And they automated basically a little programming language they wrote that allowed them to change every single ballot to write-in votes for evil computers from movies like HAL 9000 and things like that. And then they modified the actual the web form that you did this stuff to play the Michigan fight song after you cast a ballot. And so you had people saying, hey, well, what is this, patriotic sounding weird music? And then someone realized, hey, that's the Michigan fight song. It's not even DC. But anyway, it was
well, worst of all, was the elections director was a Buckeye. So
Oh!
that made it especially bad.
And so, and you see what we mean, right? I mean, we've been talking about most of the internet vulnerabilities of saying, this internet is so difficult to secure, but it's at almost every level we have these vulnerabilities. And this kind of came up earlier, and you're working on these untrusted machines on this untrusted network, and so that doesn't make it impossible, but it means you need to be going through it each and every step on this untrusted stuff and say, how can we get it trustworthy enough so that it's at least as trustworthy as the paper or the stuff that it's going to replace. And that can become a very difficult spot, especially when the manufacturers of this gear aren't always as nice as DC was. They put it up online so that it could get tested. When it got hacked, they didn't try and go to prosecutors. They said, ooh, maybe this is in fact not ready for prime time.
Part of the issue here is that we're trying to solve the problem in a very small scale when it has to operate in a very large scale. Yeah. We have different types of elections. We have federal, state, and local, and each one of them have their own specific needs and requirements. And when you're looking at a microcosm of a local election, it's easy to see how electronic voting, online voting could actually potentially work. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't scale to a state or large U.S. kind of national election. The problem really is that this needs to be a designed aspect instead of an emerging aspect. If we don't want to wait 30 years to get the internet as stable as it could be to support electronic voting online, then we need to start looking at how we can design the voting system to ride on top of that kind of infrastructure, knowing the infrastructure itself is not as secure as we would want. With mobile computing, with Internet of Things, and the other types of new advances that we're seeing, again, remember 2008, the iPhone 2009 came out. This is a very fast-moving world. We're going to have a means to secure the voting means on top of potentially an untrusted environment. And it's a different type of really looking at the problem. If we can address the problem in that kind of fashion, then it doesn't matter whether you're doing it from your iWatch or you're doing it from your computer at home, or if it's a voice recognition thing when you walk into a voting polling place or an absentee ballot from Mars.
Yeah. And I can't tell you how much Kent's call to actually standardize this stuff resonates with me, because if you look at cryptography, the way we do that is you throw a bunch of ideas out there in a very open fashion, and you get the best people in the world to bang away at them until you find flaws or you don't find anything. You don't know it's secure, and we find flaws later, but that's a pretty good it's a pretty good way to identify flaws that you may not have seen and weaknesses, and that's just a really wonderful way of thinking about this.
Jordi?
I want to mention something. One of the way that we are now focusing how to manage this risk in internet voting is to invest on using verifiability and using cryptographic ways for verifying things. Why? Since as things are evolving, it's impossible to say that now in 20 years internet is completely secure. We'll have new threats. So the idea of verifiability is the same idea of a traditional election. You cannot say, okay, I have here a ballot box, and nobody can open this, only the electoral board. I don't know, maybe in the future somebody or a magician is part of the member of the electoral board and do something that you cannot control. So the idea is that it's possible to verify each step that is happening during the voting process. So the voter, for instance, can check that at the end, the electronic vote that is stored and cryptographically protected in the server really contains the voter intent, and the counting process, for instance, is not manipulating the results. So the results really represent the contents of the cast votes. So if you can verify this in a way that you can have 100% sure, that you are 100% sure that nobody manipulates things, then you can react. Since if the voters see that, okay, the vote that has been received by the server does not contain my voter intent, then can cancel the vote and maybe use a traditional way for casting a vote. And it's a way that say, maybe I have no security problems now, but maybe in the future a hacker found a way for bypassing some security measure and try to manipulate my vote. But if I can detect this manipulation, then I can react.
Can I ask Jordi a question? So Jordi, one thing I don't know if CITL does, but it probably does, is this notion of future-proofing. So one of the weird things about voting is you want your vote to be, I mean, most of us want our vote to be private, not only now, but for a long time in the future, to the extent that someone could figure out how we voted in the past and smear our record or whatever they want to do with that information. That's a very personal thing. Some cryptographers I know have developed ways of creating cryptographic protocols that basically say, look, no matter what could happen in the future, your vote is safe at least up until we have really effective quantum computers that can crack this stuff. But that's something that I know that's the kind of thing that I really like to hear people worrying about, because I worry about my vote in 50 years as well.
Yeah, I know. This is what usually is known as everlasting privacy.
Yes, that's what I like.
Everlasting privacy.
Or perfect privacy.
Yeah. Exactly, perfect privacy. Yes, this is the idea of about, okay, we are using now cryptographic algorithms that maybe cannot be broken now, but maybe in the future using brute force attack, if we have quantum computers, maybe we can decrypt easily these votes. And our idea is that if these votes are not correlated to voters, maybe somebody can decrypt the votes, but cannot correlate these votes with voters. So the idea here is, and this is also something very important, it is not a matter about encrypting votes. And one important thing, an important requirement for the electronic voting is that also the decrypting process is preserving privacy. Yeah. That when somebody is decrypting a vote cannot correlate, for instance, the contents with this vote. If using processes that can prevent this correlation, then it doesn't matter that somebody can decrypt individually the votes, cannot correlate this vote with the identity of the voters in the futures. But in any case, we are also working with algorithms that will be more robust and cannot be
And one of the things that strikes me is when we're used to e-commerce, and some of these have brought this up, if someone does get your credit card, the most likely worst case scenario in e-commerce is someone gets a hold of your credit card and they use it and they make fraudulent purchases. And that's bad, but it's solvable, and especially we don't have to worry about it, right? I mean, at most in the United States, we would have to pay $50, and most of us don't even have to do that. So there might be some trouble about getting a new card, but essentially it's not that bad a problem for you personally. And I think we're used to that of saying, well, it's risky, but it's certainly not such a risk that it's going to scare us away from e-commerce right now. But this isn't just someone's going to get your credit card and you might have to pay $50 and do some things. You could get disenfranchised. Someone could change your vote. You could influence an election.
Tell your boss how you voted.
I'm sorry?
Tell your boss how you voted.
Right, or in some countries you could be killed if people could figure out afterwards how you voted. So the downsides of getting it wrong seem to be...
Well, the other aspect, too, is that you're not going to be able to correct the vote. Once fraud's occurred in a vote, you can prosecute the perpetrator, you can fix the problem, but you can't change the ballot numbers because you don't know how those votes actually occurred. And that by itself could be a corrupting factor in an election.
Yeah. So the
rerunning elections is really difficult.
Yeah. And Jordi had mentioned this, not just the privacy, but the verifiability, the audit, the transparency. Pamela?
This is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about evidence. When we talk in legal terms and court cases about evidence, and we talk about chain of custody of the evidence and how important it is that that's unbroken. And the reason it's important is because you have to be able to rely on it for the various applications you need to use it for. You need to rely on it all the way through the process. And so having that property of evidence of the voter's vote having been captured correctly the way they intended it, and then that correct version, not some corrupted version, being what gets counted, and then audited to demonstrate that the counting part of it was correct. There's this stepwise process that's really key. In things like, the case that you mentioned of someone getting a hold of your card, someone used my account to rent a limo in Arizona at some point. I called the bank and said, I haven't been in Arizona for 20 years, maybe, so that wasn't me. And they said, no problem, we'll make that right for you. With voting, you cast your vote maybe from remotely. You don't get to call up the election official at the county and say, so you got my ballot, I voted for so-and-so. Is that who you've got? Can you see that I voted for candidate A? They shouldn't be able to say to you, yes, I can see that you voted for candidate A. We've got it right.
Or we know your track record, and
exactly.
You voted Democrat the last 10 times. This time you voted Republican. Something must
What's
be wrong.
up?
Is your
Yeah.
vote okay? And
So that's
and
key.
we have Representative Langevin on the line, so we're going to cut to Representative Langevin, and then we will come back to audience question and answer.
Hello, am I on?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you can hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you today, and I want to thank you for the invitation to join you remotely. I especially want to thank Damon Wilson and Jay Healey and Clara Jordan at the Atlanta Council for all their efforts to make this possible. And of course, I'd rather be with you there in person. So it's somehow fitting, I guess, that this discussion is about the promise of digital democracy is happening over Skype. So, which has itself obviously democratized communications in really an incredible way. So, before I guess I begin, let me just say before I begin my prepared remarks, I have great interest in increasing voter participation in our democracy, and have always looked for innovative ways to do that. And I have a long history of being involved with the electoral process in the legislature. I served for 3 terms and took a very big interest in election reform and making voting easier. We had a number of horror stories in Rhode Island where we had people waiting in line for hours and hours to vote, and sometimes we actually had the oldest voting machines in the country, and sometimes the ballots were so long you almost had to get on your hands and knees just to read the bottom of the ballot questions and such. It seems so archaic now, but that was the reality that we faced in my lifetime, not to mention the fact that being disabled myself, I'm the first quadriplegic elected to the United States Congress, but I was never really able to vote on my own independently going into the machine. I had to have someone go in with me and assist me. And it wasn't until I became Secretary of State and I actually overhauled our entire state's election system that I actually brought true accessible voting to Rhode Island for people with disabilities, but also brought in new modern voting equipment. And I actually chaired a special legislative commission looking at alternative voting technologies and equipment when I was in the legislature, and then implemented the findings of that report when I was elected Secretary of State. But I'm excited about the future and about technology, but we have to proceed, of course, with caution as we work to ensure the integrity of the elections process. So again, I really am particularly pleased to be joining you again, because this is an issue that means a lot to me personally. It really is the marriage of 2 passions of mine. Again, going back to 1994 when I became Secretary of State in my home state of Rhode Island, really we had the imperative to confront huge challenges of both an outdated electoral system and a less than transparent government. So I've seen firsthand what shortcomings in those areas where it can do to trust and faith in government. But it also made me very passionate about the accessibility of the voting process, which is really so fundamental to our democracy. Now, e-voting has incredible promise in this regard, and especially to the population of disabled voters who may require a diversity of interfaces to the electoral process. Now, the promise of e-voting for increasing accessibility and turnout is what originally interested me in this field. But my time in Congress, though, has given me a complementary perspective on the topic. So in 2008, I founded the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus with my friend Mike McCall of Texas, because I was concerned that Congress was paying far too little attention to the potential for cyber intrusions to cause great harm to our country. Chief among my concerns is that critical infrastructure, long hardened against physical attack, could be vulnerable in this new domain. Of course, our voting infrastructure is central to our country's existence as a democracy. And just like any other sector, there are vulnerabilities in expanding the use of information technology. Our electoral system prizes two fundamental principles, of course, and that's that each person should be entitled to cast one and only one vote, and that his or her ballot should be kept secret. Unfortunately, of course, these principles can clash with our desire that elections also be verified, that a voter should have confidence that his or her vote is counted. So the traditional voting system does an excellent job of ensuring anonymity and authentication, and there are very few instances of actual voter fraud or intimidation. Verification, of course, is a bit shakier. Hundreds of thousands of ballots are spoiled each election cycle, preventing voters' voices from being heard. Additionally, the ballots themselves are vulnerable to tampering and loss after being cast. To reduce the risk, of course, we rely on distributing oversight across many individuals, reducing the chances that a single bad actor could materially alter an election's outcome. Now, e-voting systems have these same goals, but must achieve them in very different ways. For instance, in traditional systems, double voting is prevented by requiring that a citizen vote only in his or her precinct. Preventing double voting remotely while retaining anonymity is a thornier problem, since the scale can be orders of magnitude larger. A single authentication authority might cover, for example, an entire state. Challenges of scale manifest themselves in other ways, including complexity of code running the system and ability of a single bad actor to compromise multiple services. So thankfully, our academicians have some clever solutions to these problems, and it turns out that solid cryptographic systems allow one to do all sorts of counterintuitive things. But here's the rub. The channel of communication between our brilliant cryptographers and our policymakers is filled with static. For instance, end-to-end verifiability is deemed by many scholars to be essential to a trustworthy e-voting system, as it allows auditors to confirm that ballots have been counted correctly without relying on the integrity of those doing the counting. So policymakers understand this goal. No matter how corrupt your elections are, if they tamper with the results, it will be noticed. But they definitely do not understand how it's implemented in different systems. In fact, the how is often viewed as borderline magical. You might say that one e-voting system uses a mathematical property for security, and one relies on the integrity of election officials, not necessarily going to be evident to policymakers. So worse, without a concerted effort to educate politicians, there's a real risk that they will come to view different e-voting voting systems as Coke versus Pepsi, slightly different versions of the same product, when in fact the security of the competitors may be wildly different. Think think Coke versus antifreeze, I guess you'd say. So it's difficult to overemphasize this point. So let me put it another way. Politicians are used to seeing shades of gray, not 50 Shades of Gray, shades of gray, and that's generally a good thing. Policymakers need to compromise, but the ability to see ambiguity can be dangerous when confronted with facts that are not intuitive. That's why facts can be lumped in with theories during political debate. And when talking about talking to policymakers about e-voting, therefore, it's imperative that the properties that we'd like to see in a system, such as an end-to-end verifiability, are separated from implementation choices of a particular system, or else policymakers are liable to miss critical points. So, of course, policymakers are certainly not the only fallible humans involved in standing up an e-voting system. Even a cryptographically sound system relies on people to code it, people to deploy it, and people to maintain it. A coding error might open the system of denial of service attacks that halt an election. A mistake during deployment could allow an adversary to steal voting credentials and cast fake ballots. During routine maintenance, a database could be revealed instead of deleted, resulting in a huge loss of voter privacy. Now, these vulnerabilities are real, and the Haldeman Group analysis of Estonia's i-voting system, for example, showed problems across all three of these phases. So it's important to realize that our present voting systems have numerous human points of failure, but the complexity of e-voting, again, sets it apart. Being a checker or a ballot clerk in a traditional system requires few specialized skills. Being a system administrator charged with overseeing an e-voter server, on the other hand, requires significant training and experience. Being a CISO for an election requires even more. So, and experienced cybersecurity professionals right now are in short supply. This is something that I've been talking about now for years, that we don't have enough people going into these fields, and we're looking to change that in a number of ways, and starting even at the high school levels and probably even earlier than that, to encourage young people to go into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but in particular into the IT field, and especially into the field of cybersecurity. Now, part of the shortage is a result of a lag time, of course, in education. Cyber is a relatively new domain, so our universities are still ramping up cyber training capacity. But part of it is also tied to the inherent differences between cyberspace and meat space, you might say. So the defending against an adversary has always been difficult. An attacker needs to find only a single point of failure to be successful, while a defender must protect against all possible breaches. This paradigm is exponentially more challenging in cyberspace for two reasons. Now, one, it's just as easy to attack someone across the planet as it is to attack someone across the room. So the attack space is much larger. Two, it's almost as easy to attack everyone with a vulnerability as it is to attack one entity with a vulnerability, making the attack space still larger. So as a result, attacking is more lucrative, which draws off important talent even as more defenders are needed. Now, government agencies have been particularly hard hit in the battle for cyber talent. Part of this is due to the supply problem that I highlighted, and part of it is due to strict compensation rules. But we can also blame the lack of coordination within government and a corresponding duplication of effort. For example, after the recent Heartbleed vulnerability was revealed, the Department of Homeland Security got its servicers patched almost immediately. However, because it had to ask other agencies to scan their networks for the flaw, it took days before the .gov domain was completely scanned, days in which attackers were propagating in the wild, if you will. So these are challenges that have to be addressed if an e-voting solution is going to be deployed in the United States. In Congress, my Executive Cyberspace Coordination Act would clarify the lines of authority in the executive branch to allow DHS to quickly address challenges on the civilian networks and would allow for top-level budgetary review of agency cyber budgets. I've strongly advocated for increased funding for cybersecurity research to help grow our academic infrastructure to meet demand. And I'm also open to alternative hiring practices that allow programmers with non-traditional educational backgrounds the chance to protect their country. I think that if we can make use of their talents, we absolutely should. And while Congress continues to deliberate, I voiced my full support for the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I believe will help raise cybersecurity standards across the critical infrastructure domains, that a company like Target could be hacked through its HVAC vendor shows exactly why we need to promote raising the bar. So let me just say that before I close, I just have to make a brief digression into client-side security. When government or policymakers talk about implementing an e-voting system, the focus is about almost always server side. We can maintain the integrity of. I say the question should be asked: can we maintain the integrity of the ballots cast? But if the ballots itself, what if the ballot itself is compromised? Relying on a voter's PC or smartphone to honestly represent his or her intentions is simply naive, with malware as prevalent as it is. So protecting the integrity of an election is not limited to the edge of the government network. Without a risk mitigation strategy that accounts for the very real possibility of outside influence targeted on voters themselves, and the voting system really is incomplete. So to say that e-voting is a challenging prospect is really an understatement. But just as there are many security concerns with crypto systems, with the humans that run them, and with the devices that access them, there are many potential benefits as well. So I reject the notion that e-voting is a solution in search of a problem, just as I reject the notion that it's ready to be deployed today. Changing something as essential to our identity as the way we choose our leaders ought to be a deliberative process and an inclusive one. And I hope that I've impressed upon you the importance of engaging with policymakers about e-voting systems in a manner that demystifies the guts as much as possible. And as the corollary to that appeal, I hope that you'll join me in advocating for the better use and better training of cybersecurity professionals, that they may defend our country from harm and better advise our nation's policymakers at the same time. So with that, I thank you for the work that you are all doing, and thanks for the opportunity to weigh in on this issue. I thank you to allow me to join you remotely. As I said, I would have much preferred to be there in person, but given the nature of the topic, maybe this is an appropriate way to communicate with you today as well. So I look forward to working with you to address these challenges. As a big fan of technology myself, and use it every day and rely on it every day, as we all do. These are certainly exciting times, but not without risk and challenges. So thank you very much, and enjoy your conference.
Okay. Thank you, Congressman. Great. Thank you, Congressman. That was a wonderful description of the balances that we're talking about here. And Congressman Langevin, by the way, from my home district in Rhode Island, so we really grow cyber talent out of central Rhode Island. He covered a lot of even things that we hadn't talked about here, you know, about waiting lines and the amount of convenience, about aiding disabled and others that might have difficulty getting to the polls. He covered a lot of interesting things. I did disagree with him on there aren't enough cyber professionals. I think we have plenty of cyber professionals. They're all just not working for the correct side. So before we start taking the questions, any additional thoughts? And if you want to start catching my attention for hands while we get other feedback.
I thought it was great that he raised the issue of how policymakers are involved and need to be involved, and at the same time, it's really difficult when you think about the myriad things that someone brings to a congressperson any given day. Expecting them to have a deep and broad understanding of something like cryptography, which the very word makes my eyes glaze over. I'm going to go ahead and say that. You know, it's really very difficult. I think that finding the balance, you know, lawmakers do make compromises. You know, they weigh risks and potential benefits. But if it's hard to really even understand what the risks are, that makes it a little more challenging. And then sometimes policy will get made that you know, may not be taking everything into consideration just because it is so complicated. Mm-hmm. We did weigh in on the NIST framework for cybersecurity and urged that voting in elections be considered part of critical infrastructure because we think that that's something that really matters. Yeah, and the other thing he mentioned about enough cybersecurity administrators. You know, how do you compensate them enough to work at a small elections office for, you know, in a county where elections is probably only part-time of the work that they do?
Yeah. And most of my job is translation, you know, with policymakers, explaining technology to them, but also to technologists, explaining why law and policy impacts their life. But so that I resonate with that. But you know, one of the things he mentioned, I think we didn't talk about much at all, which is in the paper, is the promise for accessible. Independent, accessible interaction via these systems. A lot of people with disabilities have to use very specialized equipment to allow them to interact in digital online fora. And they often get very, very used to the one thing that they know how to use and how to navigate a screen using either like a head stick for people who are more advanced quadriplegics or, you know, certain kinds of screen readers. And I think that's a real, like, you know, Oregon, I think it is, and Pam can correct me, has something where you can essentially, it's called an online ballot marking system, and you can interact via a normal computer with something that lets you mark a paper ballot that then prints it out that you can then cast, but you get to use all your own accessible technology, your own AT equipment, and I think that there's a lot of promise in that stuff, and we want to see as many people enfranchised as possible. It's a big part of the.
I can also imagine for elderly, so instead of having to, you know, they don't
absolutely
have to go
Yeah, and I did like the point that he made when he talked about this had to be deliberative. We really do have to look at this as a problem itself, not trying to piecemeal it together.
Jordy?
I think that one important thing is that he was talking about the importance of the security of the infrastructure and to make real to allow to deploy internet voting. But I think that it should be also considered not only on internet voting, since nowadays there are a lot of systems that are related to elections, voter registration systems, etc. Anything, a lot of information related to the elections is managed by computers. Mm-hmm. And then I think that this awareness that is given internet voting about using IT on the electoral process should be also considered in other processes in the election, not only on internet voting. Yep. Since for a hacker is going to use the easy path for managing something, and if he can get access to the electoral roll and add people or manipulate things, he will try first this instead of trying to make a denial of service attack or something like this. So I think that it's important also that the debate that is bringing the security on internet voting should be also moved to other parts of the election process.
That's right. That's a great point. Okay, so for questions, I've got 1, and then 2, and then 3. No, it's gonna be the gentleman in front of you first. It's gonna be Tano I saw first, and then the microphone's gonna be coming to you from Pete.
Thank you very much. Thomas from Embassy of Estonia, like we sometimes call Estonia. I mean, I've heard a lot about the word Estonia here now, and which is great. Being the first country that had national elections online, there have been several questions about the credibility of these votes and so on. But the point that I wanted to really emphasize, and the word that I also heard here, is trust. We Estonians were so used to do everything, almost every interaction with the government through internet. And the government has really tried to make the systems as reliable as possible. So people have expectations towards the government to provide different services, and thus also the online vote is quite natural for us. And we've had several expert teams coming to Estonia and really assessing it, and for the tech geeks, now the online voting module, it's the source code is open, so I have no idea what to do with it, but I'm sure these guys can do everything. My basic question is about the trust here. If we do have the trust towards the government, then if we put that into context of the U.S., then any kind of bigger system is inherently not trusted. I mean, healthcare.gov is the biggest example, of course. So, is there any possibility that also here these technical solutions could have more trust?
I do think that we're going to get to that point as we sort of evolve. The internet has a lot of just core non-trusted aspects to it. And here in the U.S., there's also a distrust of our government. And so you really need to have the combination of both parts, trust in both areas. And it sounds like in Estonia, you have that. You have much more, you have some foundational pieces that are solving some of the problems, like your national ID card, with chip and pin approach. That provides an identity that we don't have here in the U.S. We need to get some of these building blocks in place from an identity perspective, from trying to move security down below the operating system so that you can actually try to solve the problem a bit more with a trusted platform. But that's going to take years for those platforms to get propagated throughout the home and consumer markets.
Yeah. I think it's certainly one of those things where I was recently in Bermuda over the weekend for a TED event, and it's amazing, some of the smaller countries think they're at a disadvantage, but as Estonia has shown, smaller size can be an absolute advantage because it allows you to be much more agile and much more responsive to the newer technologies as they come out, and being a change agent for it rather than having the change happen to you.
And it's one election jurisdiction, not 7,000, so it's a little different.
Is that how many we have?
7 to 10.
Yeah, wow, like 7 to 10.
And absolutely, I like to say not trust, but trustworthy. Are these systems worthy of our trust? And that goes back to pulling a page out of former President Reagan's rhetorical grab bag, trust but verify. And so to the extent that these systems, like the cryptographic ones, aim to and do, but in sort of a way that's very hard to compare Coke to antifreeze, as he said, to the extent that they can offer positive proof that this is a correct thing, that through the entire life cycle of the election, that the ballot, has made it, the data structure as the ballot has made it to the end, that's an extremely important part, and that's why you hear like Jordy talking about, how crucial the verification aspect is to these kinds of things.
We were at the DEF CON hacker conference, and Tesla had one of their electronic cars there, inviting the hackers to play with it, bang on it, trying to figure out what breaks, and that's a different relationship between manufacturers and the white hat hackers. Sorry.
Goldberg with Lineage. First of all, let me congratulate you. Excellent panel, excellent divergence of views. I think that the issue that strikes me, Mr. Gann raised, that we have an insecure infrastructure, both in terms of hardware, software, we can no longer rely upon. We have a convergence of activities. TTIP is trying to look at international trade in the digital arena, and what do? Has virtually the same kinds of concerns expressed here. National Security Council staff is beating up on National Transportation Safety Administration over vehicle-to-vehicle proposals because security is not built in. It seems to me that this council in particular can play a very useful role in calling now for a heavy investment internationally, possibly, but specifically in the United States, to get at this problem, to help us, and I'll just give a little plug to Intel and McAfee, to help companies like them make the investment across the board that speeds the introduction of safe, hardware safe software systems. Without that, none of these systems are trustworthy. We are not going to be able to put a layer on top that will ever get away from the embedded threat that reads the keys to your encryption. It just is an impossible task. So I'll just leave you this one thought. McKinsey put out in June this very recommendation. It's making its way around boardrooms. We ought to be thinking about endorsing it. Thanks.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so in this trustworthiness, I'm very curious about, and I'll ask you to go, maybe you can talk about cavalry a little bit, but first, are there things that government can do to help speed this along to this trustworthiness? You know, the trustworthiness has been part of the key questions here. Congressman Langevin brought it up. Are there other things that government can be doing to, rather than just merely regulating, to help get us to this place, to shorten this 30 to 40 years, Joe, that you had brought up?
So I certainly think so. You know, for example, in the example the gentleman raised in terms of the National Highway Transportation Security, or whatever the S is, administration, there are proposals for vehicle-to-vehicle communication, communication with vehicles, and elements of the road. So for example, if you're veering too far off the road, maybe there's a radio broadcast that says, hey man, you're gonna run off the road, right? The early proposals have things like, you know, your VIN number being broadcast in the clear to do that interaction, when that means I can just put a little piece of hardware on the road and get everyone's VIN and they're passing by. That's a pretty serious, and people care about, you know, their privacy of their location, and especially with their car where they drive. So that's something where if it's done in the open, this is one thing government can do, develop these kinds of things in the open. Then people like me, you know, we're seeing a lot of nonprofits increasingly have geeks on staff to help them navigate this kind of stuff. And people like me can say, I don't think you need a VIN number in there to actually mediate this kind of a thing. In fact, you don't even need an interaction. You just need a, hey, warning, warning, warning signal that happens, that the car can then, you know, do what it has to do to get out of that. But something Jay had mentioned, we're seeing this. Another thing that government can do is be open to sort of the revolution. I think that's, hopefully it's a revolution that's starting to happen in the hacker community with efforts like Josh Corman, and I forget the other guy's name, who is it?
Bo Woods.
Bo Woods, yeah, that have developed this effort called I Am the Cavalry, and there's another thing called builditsecure.ly, it's a website. These are efforts with the hacker community saying, look, we're often impish, we often break stuff, but we have to step up, and there's no, and that's why I Am the Cavalry has that name, there's no cavalry coming to save us. We have the responsibility as technical, clever folks to help save the world, so to speak. It's very ambitious, very sort of almost naively ambitious, but I think that you're gonna see a lot of wonderful things with people realizing, wow, it's almost better to do this stuff for good and to build things while we break things.
I think the government is doing some things with respect to, you know, the National Institute for Standards and Technology works on standards for all kinds of voting technology, and they've done a number of research reports which do help unpack what the issues are that are involved, and then describe that in ways that, you know, I think really anyone who has lots of time on their hands can read through and understand. But I think they've even written reports that are geared towards, you know, someone who works in an elections office, say. But as of yet, we haven't developed standards for an internet voting system per se in the country, and we're a little ways from that. There are some non-governmental efforts to look at what kinds of specifications might be needed, and that's a little ways off. Yet, I think what Joe said something that really I think is important, and that is getting all the stakeholders the opportunity to provide input, and that's why I really appreciated something like the cybersecurity infrastructure.
And one of the things on trustworthiness, before I go to Jordy, that really struck me in the conversations that I've had with the four of you over the past weeks was to have a machine involved in voting or technology involved in voting. There's an extensive certification process that it has to go through. And this hurts us even further on our side on security, because when you want to update it for security reasons, it means you might have to recertify it. And so it's one of those things that, on Tom's question, when we're what we can do to help the security along might be ways to speed that process up, so that we can get the more secure technologies out more quickly.
Having a system that you can tell at the back end if it worked right in the election can help you eliminate some of those heavy certification times at the front end. But it requires the ability to robustly audit that system.
Jordy?
Yes, I think that when we are talking about trust, is that it's not focusing on, there are people that by default trust the government. I think that it should be how to allow the critics to verify that things are happening in the proper way. And we are talking here about using specific hardware, etc. I think that that security should be a combination of different things. Using trustworthy hardware, etc. Will make the security issues more difficult to happen. But I think that an important piece is also the verifiability, the auditability of the election. So in case that this protection fails, it's possible to detect that this happens. So it should be a combination of both. And the combination of both is giving trust. Since maybe there are people that trust the computer since has been developed or has been certified by a certain authority. But there are critics that say, okay, I want to check at any time of the voting process that this computer is behaving properly. So we need to combine both things. The certification will ensure that at least security practices has been taken into account when this computer has been developed. But the verifiability is giving the auditability during the voting process that nothing nasty is happening there.
Okay.
So I think that this is a combination of both.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to do Ron, and then we're going to come over to this side, and then the gentleman here. So to the gentleman front on your right here.
Thank you. Hi, Ron Bandes, network security analyst with the CERT program at Carnegie Mellon University. First of all, Representative Langevin's impressive knowledge on this subject may make me change my mind about Congress.
Yeah, or Rhode Island.
I am a New Englander originally.
Yeah.
Yeah, Joe stole my thunder a little bit, saying the difference between trust and trustworthiness, and that's exactly right. But we don't want even the government to be what's trustworthy, right? We want the systems to be what's trustworthy. Just yesterday at a security conference here in DC, General Keith Alexander, the recent head of both the NSA and Cybercom, said the current architecture of the internet is indefensible. So what we need for trustworthiness is, number one, not mathematical proofs that that ballots can be verified end to end. What we need is transparent systems that all voters can understand. And the main way we know to do that is with durable paper records, which have the additional benefit of allowing the voters' intent to be re-examined and provide meaningful recounts and audits.
Yeah, okay, good question.
Yeah, so that is really my question, and you know, isn't the trustworthiness in the systems really what matter? And the other aspect of that is the supervised voting, right, which is an insurmountable problem for internet
actually,
voting.
I'd like to go to Jordy, I mean, because I think you're right on this transparency and what voters can understand. And so you're deploying this technology, you're getting it out there, you're interacting with voters all the time on this. How's that trustworthiness of the voters in the system? I mean, do they come out of it and feel, boy, that was great, I understand how this works?
Well, usually what happens is it's more or less what I said before. The majority of voters trust the systems. Then we have the critical, we have critics that I think that are important. Since we need to have people that do not trust on systems, otherwise then systems need to be auditable. So people then tend to say, okay, it doesn't matter if there is one. So it's important that the system needs to be audited. One way for doing this is by paper ballots. If we are talking about unsupervised voting, this can work. But when we are talking about remote voting, which will be the solution, for instance, if we are talking about online voting, since maybe voter can print the paper at home, but what is going to happen with this paper? It is enough or not? So, and this I think that is the important part of using these cryptography approaches to allow also the verifiability of what is happening inside the voting process when we are using only a computer when casting the vote.
And some of the phrases we talked about earlier is the justified confidence. Because we as people that are involved in security in some way or another, we see that people have tons of confidence in things in the internet that we just say, oh my God, there's no justification. I can't believe these people have confidence in this system. If they only knew what we knew.
Exactly.
Well, and I'll throw another bug in your ear, which is the reason that durable paper records are so important. You can see in this theory put forth by Ron Rivest, who's the R in RSA security, a very prominent cryptographer, a good friend of ours, and John Wack at NIST, who's another good friend of ours, a standards guy. They have this theory called software independence, which is the notion that an undetectable change in the software does not result in an undetectable change in the outcome.
Oh, that's
and the way you do that, unfortunately now, is, fortunately from my perspective, unfortunately for this debate, is that you do have some sort of durable physical media that the voter has the opportunity to verify that then you can recount later. And the point being that, I think we realized, and we won this fight in the late 2000s, that if you don't have something to audit, if you don't have something to recount that is independent from the software, you may be in a world of hurt. And then people like Philip Stark, in my postdoc at Princeton, we worked on what he would kill me to say if I said this, but I'm just going to say it because you guys will understand it better. The notion of statistical recounts, which we call risk limiting audits. The whole point being that if you compare a subset of the ballots, the physical ballots, with the data structures, the actual electronic ballots, and you don't find enough error, statistically speaking, that would show you that the outcome would change if you actually recounted all the things, then you don't have to do a recount. Then you can just stop, and you know that there's no error that would have been possible with some level of confidence to actually to meaningfully modify the outcome to where someone else would have won. And so California, and sorry to be so long, California actually changed their law recently to you could do the traditional way of certifying the machine on the front end and doing everything, or you can sort of skip all of that as long as after the fact, ex post, you can do one of these audits and show that no one else would have won, that the outcome that was reported is the correct outcome. So you don't have to do all this other stuff. The trick is, what happens if you find enough error? Well, then you end up doing a full recount, which in a state like California could be a pretty hairy proposition.
Sir? Great, thank you.
We know this guy.
Thank you. Jeremy Epstein, SRI International. The point of internet voting is, of course, to make it easier for voters to cast their votes in a way that gets cast and counted accurately. And the next generation is the end-to-end or cryptographic voting systems that a number of you have mentioned. 2 recent studies have come out that caused some concern. One showed, and admittedly these are in a laboratory setting, one showed that voters in fact could not figure out how to do the verification with the 3 of the most commonly used end-to-end cryptographic systems, that it was just too complicated for them to understand how. And another study, which is about to be released, shows that even if they can figure out how, they aren't motivated. They don't understand why. So my question is, how do we get to systems that have the desired capabilities but also offer what the voter needs? And another piece of this is the notion of being able to cast multiple ballots, as is allowed in Estonia. And that's a great thing, but voters, by and large, don't understand why they should want to do this. The technology allows it, but if the voters don't understand why to use it, it doesn't actually provide a mechanism. How do we get to the cyber-human parts of the voting issue? Thank you.
Great.
So I hate to talk so much. I'll be really brief. Sorry. Part of it's storytelling. You know, you can say the challenge in voting is convincing the loser they lost. That's a really pithy way that everyone understands instantly. Like, oh wow, your brain actually folds the first time you hear that. If we can describe some of these cryptographic primitives in those terms, like, you know, I can tell you about Diffie-Hellman key exchange using a box with 2 locks on it, and I can actually teach you the high-level notion of what that is. We need to be able to do things like that don't cover just little components, but actually can talk about their role, the role of the technology, the role of the primitives, the theory in accomplishing the integrity that we need.
Part of the problem is, do the consumers really care? I mean, if they're actually executing a vote, they want to go in, make their decision, push the button, and they're done. Their vote's counted. That's the extent. So that's sort of the challenge that we have to get over is to, you know, make sure we have means that allow for the system to help them do that in a very, very simple way.
I can tell from the experience of the Norwegian project, since in this project we introduced the sending return codes to allow voters to verify that the selections made or the vote that is stored in the server really contains the voter intent. And one of the problems that we have in this project is how to balance this verifiability for the voters and the usability of the system. And then one thing that is very, very important is most of the people don't care about this. So usually this verifiability is more introduced to allow the people that do not trust the system can verify the system is working properly. So the way is, how can we introduce this verifiability in a way that is not aware for the system? So the way if the system can distinguish between somebody that is going to verify and somebody that is a regular voter, then can make any kind of trick, and then only only say, okay, if you are a regular voter, then I know that I can make an attack. You are an auditor, then I'm not going to make any attack. So the problem is, how can we provide this as an option that is not jeopardizing the voting process for the voter, that not making the voting process difficult to understand and difficult to know why I need to make this verification, but at the same time to make the verification efficient. So, and we put this as an option in some cases, but in a way that is not. And for instance, the codes are always sent by to the voters, but the voters don't need to verify them. What usually happens, a study that was made in Norway, it was just only an extrapolation, but about near 70% of the voters that receive the return codes check the return codes.
Oh wow!
But this was it has not been based on a real study. It was based on a problem that they have when printing some voting cards. So there were some voting cards that were wrong. So they receive calls saying people, okay, this voting card that I received is wrong since the verification is not correct, and based on the number of voting cards wrong, and the people that call make an extrapolation about, okay, that means that 70% of the people that receive the wrong voting cards detect the error. So.
And that's one of the good things. The more experience that we have in this, the more data that we're going to have for these studies and to figure out.
Exactly. Since I think that is not part of the Norwegian system has not been studied, at least here in the U.S. And it's a system that is, since 2011, the source code is public. So, and also the cryptographic protocol, etc., has been shown in different in different conferences. So. And our experience is that usually it's important to design a verification process that is easy for the voters, And what is more important is that the critics understand what is happening there. If the voter doesn't understand, sometimes if the vote is counted, it's fine for them. So the important part is that the system cannot distinguish between who is an auditor and who is a regular voter.
Pamela?
Well, I think that voters, by and large, don't always care what kind of voting system they're going to be faced with when it's time to go vote. And I think it's, what's more compelling to them is who they want to vote for and whether they think this election is important or important enough to make the effort. And once they get there, I think it's the responsibility of all the stakeholders who care about elections and democracy generally to make sure that what is there is not only available and functioning, but is going to work all the way through the process. You said something that caught my attention, and it's, you hear about all these breaches. Every day there's more news stories about this, that, and the other issue with the big bad internet. And you wonder sometimes where the idea of sending something as valuable as votes over the internet was, how did that get to be a good idea when you know some of those things? But I think that as a nation, we have this natural inclination to a sort of can-do spirit. And we tend to admire when people sort of make light of challenges and obstacles, sort of minimize them a little bit, because I think if they're less daunting, we can do this. We can overcome it. We can apply ourselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's actually internet voting in the country today. And the unfortunate part of it is that it's if there are shades of bad, it's sort of the worst of the worst. It's ballots being sent in unencrypted email attachments to elections offices and the like. And I told someone about this one time who does security consulting for large firms when I was sitting next to him on a plane, and he his eyes got large, and he just wanted to cover his ears and not hear what I was telling him. He was, no, that can't possibly be true. It is true. So it really, I think there's a lot of bridging that needs to happen for people to understand what the key challenges are, what the properties are that we need, and work on those kinds of research problems as to how to get there.
Yeah, and I liked how you phrased that in the can-do, and I think it's the can-do frontier spirit of Rhode Island that's
that must
really,
be it. That must
really
be
carrying us through. Okay, so final round of comments here. So Joe had said 30 to 40 years, which is kind of a long time. That means the digital natives that are using this now are going to be 40s, 50s. It means I'll be in my young 60s, and that's a long way. So I'm curious if the other panelists agree with that time frame, and maybe if there's one kind of thing that we can do, and just that one thing, what we would like. And I think I'll start on my left with Kent.
I think that's maybe a little long because of the whole process of how fast technology is advancing. But there does need to be a focused effort around trying to deal with the problems today. We have to do a better job. Some of the building blocks I mentioned earlier, identity is a big one. There's a reasonable amount of things that you can do to provide a more secure environment if you know who you're talking with. But you still have those underlying issues of the user PC or mobile device has to be as secure, or you have to have a captured environment to be able to actually execute those types of activities, such as voting. I don't think it's going to take quite that long, but if we want to really sort of push this, we really need to look at, looking at the concerted effort to design a national environment that's standards-based, that's going to be able to scale. If we're solving a local issue, fine. I think we can do that without a lot of work, and definitely within 30 or 40 years. If we're solving a national issue, we have real problems that need to be addressed, real design considerations that have to be taken, and discern whether or not we're going to look at doing this on top of a trusted or an untrusted environment. And there's decisions that need to be made. And until we can get to a national focus, we're not going to solve the problem.
Joe, what do you think? Do you agree with this 30 to 40 years thing?
So I do, because I said it, and let me give you the basis for why I said 30 to 40 years, is that if you talk to folks, and folks like Jeremy, who evaluate these kinds of proposals, if you talk to people who design protocol stacks for the next generation internet, which is a whole bunch of words, but just think of it as what might replace what we have now, their most optimistic projections for getting this stuff deployed in a way that you can have as coherent of an internet as we have now is 30 to 40 years. And things like BGP-sec. So this is something that no one in the room probably knows anything about, but this is a way to do secure routing on the internet. Right now you have folks, we don't know who, doing adversarial routing attacks where suddenly a route on the internet from one side of Denver to the other side of Denver is rerouted through Kazakhstan for a couple of hours. And like, what the heck? Anyway, so there's things like that that I don't think you can fully solve until we have sort of a fully deployed, well thought out, not piecemeal, path dependent kind of internet. So I just say that's why I'm saying that these things, and there's other things that aren't the internet that are a problem too, but those things I'm more optimistic about. It's the internet that I think is the rate limiter.
The rate limiter. Okay, good.
So I think while we might be an optimistic nation, I'm going to shout out for Missouri now, we're also kind of a show me people. And rightly so. I think we need to ask ourselves, what's the floor beneath which we're not willing to sink? Voters might not think too much about the voting system, but I think we owe ourselves as a democracy, as a nation, systems that do produce the needed evidence that you can use in the event of any failures, things go wrong, Murphy's Law, to recreate the intent of the voter and know that that was, in fact, the correct outcome. I think Joe's probably on the money, but who knows? But I think he's on the money with the time frame. That's my take.
Yeah.
I think that we don't need to wait 30 or 40 years, since we will find in 30, 40 years another risks. Risk will be always there. The important part is that we are designing solutions that allow us to manage this risk in a way that it is acceptable, since risk is also present in traditional elections. And what is happening also now is that also there are people that is thinking about how to use also technology to attack traditional elections. So risks are evolving. I think that we need to think about which are the current risks, which are the solutions that are proposed by different parties like my company, and to see if they are acceptable to use for everybody in an election, only for certain groups. But I think that we need to move. We cannot wait, since if we wait, then we will find other risks in the future, and we are not going to move now. So I think that we have good technology now for introducing internet voting, and if we want to limit the risk of this introduction, we can think about only using certain people, but risks are also present in traditional elections. And in case of online voting, I think that postal voting is not a solution. That is not.
Yeah, and I like, I think if some of the things we might do to shorten that is, having these elections like Tacoma Park, like Norway, like Estonia, where we can get our heads around this and figure out how people are actually going to use it. We can lay the sidewalks, but until we really start using this, we won't know how people really want to use this technology. My concern on the longer term is that defense is getting better, and we can imagine how long it's going to take us to solve these problems, because we're on this slope. Unfortunately, the attackers have been on this slope, maybe even exponential. So the farther out, my concerns are that the attackers might get much, much better at this than the defenders are, because that's been the path. But this is what McAfee has been trying to get at with this project that we've been doing with them, is the pivot to the positive, and saying if we want to unlock these gains, we've got to start getting security right. And to us, that's the important message of not just talking about the downsides and the risks, but also talking about the benefits that we can unlock if we get this right. So I wanted to thank, again, McAfee and my panelists. I wanted to thank Clara Jordan, who had helped put this together, and Paul and Robbie, who are doing our tweets. The people doing the microphones are volunteers. They're interns here. So please say hello to them, thank them, give them jobs. Our next event, 22 October, National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, will be here. to talk about updates on the threats. So we'll have Tom Corcoran from the House Committee on Intelligence. We'll have Dmitry Alperovich of CrowdStrike here to talk about risks. On the 5th of November, we will have 4th of November, we will have an event here on NATO and talking about NATO's new cyber strategy. That's going to be with Sorun Dikaru, the Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, so the top NATO official doing cyber, and some others. I'm sorry, it probably won't be here, but on the 4th of November. And keep your eyes open for the next paper in the Pivot to the Positive that we're doing with Microsoft. I'm sorry, with McAfee. And with McAfee and that's going to be looking at embedded medical devices and other parts of healthcare. Again, one of these places that if we don't get security right, we're not going to be able to unlock all the amazing potential that we can find, and we're doing that with McAfee. Okay, so thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you for all of you for being here and making us so smart on this issue. Thank you for being here with McAfee. Great, thank you.